Welcome to Found in Conversation, the film and podcast series that pushes intellectual frontiers and promotes the values of long-term thinking, independence, entrepreneurship, and responsibility. I'm Edie Lush, your host. I'm delighted to be in conversation today with Ed Conway. He's the author of The Material World, a book that tells the stories of the 6 materials that built our modern world: sand, salt, iron, copper, oil, and lithium. They are the building blocks of modern civilization. As Ed says in the book, they have fueled the prosperity of empires, helped us build cities, and tear them down. They have changed the climate and, in time, may help us save it. These materials are the unsung heroes of our modern age, and it's time we heard their story. It feels like in some times in the world, we don't think about this idea of supply chain, right? We don't think about the idea of how things get from one part to another. They just sort of turn up and miraculously become a phone in our pocket. But sometimes those supply chains break down, right? We've seen that recently with COVID-19, with the war in Ukraine. And that suddenly is when the material world becomes a big part of all of our lives. And you tell the story of an extraordinary time in history when this happened in the UK around World War I.
Yeah, well, so in the run-up, when we think of silicon technology these days, we tend to think of silicon chips, understandably, because it's this amazing tool that we've taken out of the ground. You've got chunks of quartz and we turn them into semiconductors. It's amazing. But back in 100 years ago, the silicon technology of the age was glass, so optics. And the First World War was this, perhaps the first great war where you were able to shoot further than you could see. So being able to have binoculars, sniper scopes, all of that stuff, telescopes, was really important. And hitherto, the UK and Britain rather, was one of the world leaders in making glass. And then the government comes along and needs to raise some money and says, okay, well, let's tax that industry. So they started taxing glass. As a result of that, the German glass industry, companies like Zeiss and Schott, making glass, and Britain, all of a sudden, having had this great industry where we're making lots of binoculars, gradually comes to rely on Germany for about 60% of all of its binoculars. Then along comes the war. And of course, the UK, all of the troops from Britain going out to the trenches, they need binoculars in order to defend themselves, in order to see where the snipers and the fighters are, but they don't have them. So there's a big crisis. It was known as the glass famine. There's appeals that are launched for families to donate pairs of field glasses and opera glasses to the troops going out to Germany and to the Western Front.
The royal family donates some opera glasses and some binoculars.
Exactly. So you have this strange kind of image of soldiers going off to fight in the trenches with these kind of gilt-edged opera glasses.
Imagine.
But the interesting thing about this, of course, is that up until that moment, no one thought it mattered. No one thought it mattered that the UK was, that Britain was reliant on Germany for 60% of all of its binoculars. And then all of a sudden, a moment comes along and it does matter. And that's why kind of COVID is another good example of this stuff. It seems you can get quite complacent about, where things come from. You can just think to yourself, it doesn't matter. Price is all that matters. But then all of a sudden there comes a war or a trade disturbance or a pandemic, and those things really do matter. It's the stuff that seems kind of cheap. It seems like it doesn't matter all that much. But without it, in some cases, we're literally unable to survive. And the kind of startling thing is how many of those supply chains, as we call them today, links of dependence, how many of those supply chains have these pinch points where one single thing goes and then the rest kind of topples over. And you
For
see
example,
it throughout. Well, I mean, so one good example of that is with silicon chips, for instance, making silicon chips. And I think most people would appreciate that to make a silicon chip, that final stage that we hear a lot about, putting transistors that are smaller, so small that they're kind of smaller than the wavelength of visible light. That stuff, most people kind of understand that that's amazing. You can fit on a silicon chip the size of your fingernail, you can fit billions of transistors. It is mind-blowing. But even before you've got to that stage, that piece of silicon that's come out of the ground has been around the world numerous times. It's been through so many different companies. It's been transformed again and again. And one of the transformations that turns it into this incredibly pure silicon wafer that then becomes the substrate on which you're putting these transistors. One of those transformations involved it being melted down in a very special type of crucible. And that is kind of where you get your silicon wafers from. Well, those crucibles they're made with a special type of quartz that you only get, at least in large quantities, from one quarry site in the world. And this is a place, one of the people who used to work there said to me, if you fly a crop duster, like a plane over it with a particular type of chemical and dust, just spread it over the quarry site, then you would stop silicon chip production across the world in a matter of a few months. And it's just game over for the modern economy. That is how fragile this world is. He said, he told me what the chemical was, but he said, don't tell people, don't spread it. So I haven't. But it just underlines there are these pinch points. Yeah. And so thinking about those things in advance rather than when a crisis happens might be kind of a useful thing to do.
And that's what's extraordinary in the story that you tell about the Great Glass Famine, is that actually by the end of the war, Britain was a glass manufacturer again. And so it got its own industrial strategy going.
We can reindustrialize. I think that's the encouraging thing. And I think it's a lesson for where we are now, is that in a circumstance where you really need to, you can actually bring back old industries. You just need to have the determination and the willingness to invest.
Well, let's talk a little bit about lithium, one of the elements created in the Big Bang. Yeah. So pretty old. No other element has quite the same combination of lightness, conductivity, electrochemical power, and no other metal is quite as good at storing energy. Yeah. So if we think about a world where we are trying to eliminate carbon emissions and phase out fossil fuels and needing to electrify the world, we're going to need lithium, right?
Because we're dependent on lithium, not just for smartphones, but for all of these electric cars that are going to replace all of our petrol cars, supposedly, we need to mine more lithium in the coming years than we ever have done before. In fact, we need to ratchet up the amount of lithium that we're getting out of the ground faster than any previous episode of mining metals in the past. So there are many unprecedented things we need to do in the future, but lithium is a really good example of it because we just historically don't have that much experience of mining it. And like you say, at the moment, most of it's in terms of the reserves, so the stuff that's proven that we know how to get out of the ground. Most of that's in the so-called lithium triangle in Chile and Bolivia and Argentina. And that's in an interesting form, which is a kind of brine lithium. So it's this underground reservoirs, basically, of really salty water that also contains lithium salts in it.
Something like 3 miles deep?
And it's a spooky thing. Having been out to the Atacama and to the Salar de Atacama, which is the main one, having stood on the surface of it, thinking that you're standing on this kind of subterranean reservoir and just a few meters beneath your feet are these extraordinary reserves of lithium is kind of amazing. We're really at the start of our understanding of how to mine this material. But I do think that we have to get it from new places, and somewhere like the Salar de Atacama, that is a pristine ecosystem. It's one of the driest places in the world. Is going to be affected by mining. We know it's affected, and the people who are mining there, they make no bones about it. They're trying to do it as sustainably as possible, but you can't go into the ground and pull stuff out without having some form of an impact. And you have an impact on the local ecosystem. You have an impact too on local communities, and there's many people who live within these communities. Like I said, it's a very water parched area, and they see it there, and they look down at the Salar. And I talk to lots of these people, and they're angry about it.
We talked about the story of the Great Glass Famine. And when we think about conflict and the impact on the material world, one of the next kind of questions is, where could we see a future conflict and how could that future affect our material world? So we have to think about lithium in this context, lithium batteries in China. China, you point out in the book, controls about 80% of the world's battery capacity. Tell us what that means, and also, how did that happen?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Because if you think about think about that story with the binoculars. Back then, at that point, Britain was reliant on Germany for about 60% of all of the binoculars it was importing. Right now, Britain, Switzerland, Europe as a whole, the US to some extent as well, is reliant on China to a greater extent for the batteries that it's putting in electric cars, for all of the rare earth minerals it needs to go into those wind turbines, also, frankly, for the steel that it's putting into those wind turbines as well, and other technologies too. I mean, look at solar panel manufacturing. China is so utterly dominant within that technology. And only about 15, 20 years ago, Europe had most of the patents. Europe had most of the IP on solar. China's just part of the explanation for why China is dominant there and on batteries is they've been incredibly strategic about this. If you think about the kind of cost of that solar panel, that cheap solar panel, which right now it's cheaper buying a solar panel than buying a fence, which is madness. But part of the reason it's so cheap is because it's kind of, you're not paying the full price. So within that cost, you're not paying the price of the carbon emissions it takes to make that solar panel. And there are quite a lot of them because making silicon, it's actually the same process of making a semiconductor, a silicon chip. Making solar panels is a really energy intensive process. And a lot of that is done with coal in China right now, especially when you think about Xinjiang province, where a lot of these solar panels are made. When you think about the fact that a lot of the waste product from these solar panels is just thrown into rivers rather than, you wouldn't be allowed to do that in Europe. You wouldn't be allowed to do that in the US. So there is a kind of question of whether we're properly pricing these items. And I think there's a very reasonable conversation and challenge that the US and Europe are having.
Let's talk about how we might wean ourselves off of extraction. You talked about manufacturing, and there's another term you used, which is unmanufacturing, which I love. Where are we seeing people unmanufacture these batteries so that we could get the lithium as well as the other materials back in order to then remake them again?
I think it's quite exciting. I mean, recycling and taking something apart hasn't traditionally been seen as a very sexy sector, but in future it needs to be, because this is where we will mine. We will mine the old stuff from the past. And at the end of its life, that car might go for, I drive an electric car and it's kind of 7-8 years old.
Yeah.
And it might go for 100, 200,000 miles or something, if we're lucky. But at the end of that, you can take that lithium and you can recycle it. And at the moment, it's still early days because obviously the electric car age is still in its infancy. But in future, so many of the batteries could basically be repurposed, recycled. At the moment,
you get 50% of it back. Is that right, when you recycle it?
It's the exciting part of this. And there is no way of getting to a more sustainable planet without recycling more. And all of this quite humdrum but really important process becomes core to how we have a more kind of sustainable circular economy in the future.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here on Founding Conversation. Absolutely delighted, and I very much love the book. Recommend it to everyone. Thank you.